welcome to part 2 with James from Opnalax. If you haven't already, check out part 1 to get the context. In this episode, we'll be talking about frames, panes, air gaps, and everything else to do with Windows systems. Enjoy.
I actually just thought it would be good to base the conversation around similar to what you presented during the webinar, because I really like that content. So just going through the types of glazing, and I like how you explained them as well. The things to consider when installing them. So it's not just about the glass itself, or the glass is just one part of the equation. You got to consider the entire thing as well. And then the glass spacing and gases, I think, was the heading or subheading you had. Like, I really liked how you broke down everything. And then towards the end, just talking about the specialized glass, and then we'll touch a little bit on triple glazing as well, whether it's worth it just what are the implications of that. And then the last one is just that question. I'll probably actually begin with that question of if you're a window, what would you want to be? Then just going through the different window types, the timber, PVC, and all that.
Absolutely. All right.
Yeah.
Well, mate, it's great to connect with you again. I really appreciate our chats, and appreciate the opportunity to be able to, share with you and whoever's listening to us. So firstly, if you haven't had a chance to listen to our first chat around why we need to talk around some, good performing or great performing windows or higher performing windows, then I would absolutely encourage you to firstly listen to that chat. But if you haven't, the very first thing I sort of want to consider is living in the houses that we live in, especially now more than ever, we have to be comfortable in the space that we're in, right? We need to be comfortable in the space that we're in, because we're literally in our houses more than we've ever been. And that level of comfort to me is super important. Usually when we think about windows, we just think about something that we can look through, right? Or something that we can walk through or get some air through. But we haven't really considered about all the other tangible or sort of intangible things that we can get from them, such as, reduction of noise, right? When it comes to better sleep, when it comes to things like better, heating and cooling efficiency, right? By reducing the need for artificial heating and cooling, right? When we're talking about extra layers of glass that now make it more secure and safer for us in our environments, right? And that's obviously where we focus. But now it's a matter of, okay, now that we understand why it's important for us to have great performing windows, the next part of that question, or the next part of that conversation, really comes down to, how do we know what a high performance window is? And that's really what I want to share with you today. And that's what I want to equip with you today, right? So that you can, regardless of who you're speaking to around Windows, that you can be equipped with the information that you need to have.
Yeah.
And usually what I'm sharing, right, and usually what I share in my webinars and, in the information sessions that I give, what I generally give, what I equip with you literally today, you are more often than not going to be more equipped than most builders and most architects, to the point where you're probably actually going to be more equipped than most Windows salesmen, right? And I think that's the biggest important thing, right? That you can walk into a conversation theoretically knowing just as much, if not more, than the person that you're speaking to. And you can literally filter through the information that comes through and decide what you choose to move forward on, right?
Yes.
So ultimately, right, most people will start talking to you around glass, right? And they'll say, get this type of glass because that will solve your problems. Buy double glazing because that will solve your problems. You've got heating issues, double glazing will fix that. If someone's speaking to you around glass, they are speaking to you halfway through the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And what I want to really stress here is, at the end of the day, you could have the best performing glass inside of a window, right? You can have the best performing glass, like exceptional results. But remember that glass has to go inside of a window, right? It has to go inside of a window frame. And more often than not, most window frames are actually the worst performing part of a window. So here we are with all these bells and whistles, spending all this money on the glass, but who cares what type of glass we have if that glass is going into a frame that doesn't perform well? And so this is really where, from my point of view, I really like to shape the conversation in saying that we need to start at the beginning of the conversation. Yeah. Right? That's ultimately what happens. Let's start at the beginning. Why are we starting halfway through? Right? A marathon doesn't start at the beginning. It doesn't start, 10 kilometers in. Right? It starts at the beginning. Why are we having conversations that start halfway through a conversation? Right? Yeah. Especially if we're getting to know each other. Right? I'm not automatically going to start talking around, your ex-partners when when I'm introduced myself to a new girl, right? The first thing is I'm going to find out a little bit about who you are, right? This is where we start, right? So the very first thing to consider is the window itself, right? The window frame. But before we even start talking about what that frame is made of, we need to make sure that that window frame is sealed properly. And this is really where I start talking generally around fridges, right? We all understand how important it is to close our fridge door, right? We all get it. To the point that the fridge knows. The fridge knows if it's closed or not closed. It literally starts beeping at you. Beep, 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 beep. And you're like, oh, what's that noise? Oh, the fridge wasn't closed properly, right? We all get it. Like, I have some young children. I literally feel like every second thing that I say to them is, close the fridge, close the fridge, close the fridge, right? Don't leave the fridge open for too long, right? Yeah. Because we all subconsciously understand that if the fridge is not closed, if the door is open, one of two things is going to happen. We're going to spoil the food that's in there, and we're going to run up our electricity bills and use more energy than what we need to. Pretty simple stuff, right? Yeah. And then, so therefore, if we have the fridge closed, and let's say the fridge isn't it feels like it's overrunning, we are using probably a lot more energy that we need to, and things are, spoiling a little bit, even with the fridge door closed. The very first thing we think about is, well, clearly we need to change those seals on the fridge, right? Like it's pretty self-explanatory. The first thing is, great, let's change the seals. Suddenly we've literally breathed new life into this fridge purely because we've replaced the seals, right? And so I find it really interesting that subconsciously we all get it. We all understand how important it is to close the fridge door, and that there needs to be a compression and make sure that no cold air is escaping. So we keep our ice cream frozen in our freezers, we keep our beer cold, and yet we won't incorporate that same technology into our own houses to keep ourselves comfortable or keep ourselves cool. And so this is really what I find quite interesting. So the very first thing to consider, if you get nothing else other than what I'm speaking to you right now, is find a window frame that is sealed. That's it. We can literally stop the podcast right now. It's all talked about, mate. Right? If you get nothing else, get that one thing, right? I feel like I talk about seals every single day. I feel like, I'm probably going to start growing some flippers or something. I talk about it so much, right? Yeah. Seals, make sure it seals. It needs to be airtight, right? We understand, when it comes to fridges, they sort of have that suction, right? You close the door and it's it sucks in, and and you can just tell. Yeah. Yeah. Right. And then sometimes you literally just close the fridge. You're like, oh, I actually needed something else out of that. And then you try and open it and sort of it's stuck. That is exactly how your windows should work. They should seal, because we should not be allowing external forces to dictate what happens inside. But the great thing about a window is that we have the option to. We can open the window and allow cross ventilation to come through, right? So when we talk about high performance windows, you are never going to get a high performance window if you do not have a window frame that is 100% airtight and sealed. So the very first thing to consider, does it seal? If it does, biggest tick, fantastic. We can move on to the next part of the conversation, right? And the next part of the conversation then comes down to the window frame itself. Right?
Just before we jump onto the window frame, are there key locations around the window that you should be looking for the ceiling? Or paying
so this is a great
attention
thing.
to?
So I think the very first thing to consider when we're talking around seals, and that's a great question to ask, is that ultimately there's two types of seals. right? We have the most conventional seals that are brush seals, right? And we've all seen them before, right? They're, just lots of little hairs on windows, and all they do is really stop dust and sort of dirt, and more so clean the window as you literally close it, right? Because it brushes up against it. Yeah. But they're not airtight. What we need to be looking for is literally rubber gaskets, just like the same stuff you would see on your fridge. Literally, you squish it and it sort of compresses and then comes back. Like you would expect it to be rubber, right? So the very first thing, is it a rubber seal or is it brush seal? If it's brush, literally walk away. Like there's no point in you buying it, because any money that you spend on that is not going to high performance window, and it's not going to give you the level of comfort that we literally deserve to be in, right? I'd also potentially be looking for like double seals. So most sort of window suppliers would have, multiple like rubber seals, not just one single one. They sort of comes up and compresses, but literally two, one on the opening portion and then one on the frame itself, obviously. So it's sort of like an L shape, if you can imagine. So it's like interlocks itself. And that's really where you're going to get the best seal. On top of that, right, when we talk about, seals, it's actually super important, because seals are they don't just impact the performance, the thermal performance of the window or the energy efficiency of that window, right? They're actually all encompassing. Having a sealed window not only makes it more energy efficient, right, but it also makes it quieter. So again, absolutely. Like if we're now talking around, sound issues and, living on highly populated and high density areas or construction yards or whatever else, right, that's going on. At the end of the day, who cares what type of glass you have in reducing that noise if sound is just literally going to travel straight through the frame itself? So we get excellent results when it comes to sound reduction when the window frame is sealed. So we talk around energy efficiency, how important it is, right? Because we understand when it comes to the fridge, but more so than that, it comes down to acoustic performance as well. So it's all encompassing. In relation to, security, it doesn't really impact that much, right? Yeah. But when it comes to security, most sort of sealed windows would have multiple points of locking. Right. And the idea behind having multiple locks is literally to reinforce those seals. If you can imagine, right, you've got a window that, I'm sure you would have seen it plenty of times before. You close a sliding window, it sort of latches a little bit, but then there's a gap up the top of the window and a gap down the bottom. Either it's not aligned properly or whatever else it is, right? But it's sort of only got one catch. Yeah. And that one catch is holding it, but everywhere else is still gappy, like there's still holes everywhere. And so the idea behind having multiple locks is that if one of those locks is obstructed, right, if one of those strikers are not lining up the way that they should, the other locks will actually pull it into place, right, and either eliminate the gaps that are being occurred or minimize those gaps. Right. Until it can be properly, worked out to, obviously eliminate that. Having multiple, having a sealed unit, a sealed window is going to make it quieter and also make it more energy efficient. And it generally will have multiple locks, which is the part that adds to the security. Right. And you can see how like literally doing one thing, you actually impact all these other things. They're all sort of complementary. Someone comes to me and says that I've got a noise issue. Fantastic. We can solve that noise issue or, positively impact that noise issue, but also positively impacting a heating and cooling issue, right? So
there's a lot of core benefits.
Absolutely. It's all complementary. By doing one, you're impacting it and doing something on the other side as well. Like the amount of feedback that we get from some customers that are purely on thermal performance are like, I don't realize how quiet it was. Your issue wasn't acoustics, but you've actually impacted it so much by fixing one that you've impacted something else as well, right? Yeah. And this is where this level of comfort comes in. Like it's all encompassing. It should be quieter, more comfortable, right? Safer. All of those things all complement each other. So then in saying that, right, if we're talking about performance, we've ticked off the first thing around seals. Hopefully, People understand how important it is for their windows to seal, just like their fridges, right? Even their eskeys, let's talk about that, right? The very first thing is to close the lid of the esky, because the ice is going to take, it's not going to, the ice isn't going to melt as quickly. Exact same concept, right?
Yeah.
We then come down to the type of window. Now there is, a couple of different types of windows. The most sort of common window is obviously an aluminium window. I would say probably, 80% of windows are aluminium, right? Across the board here in Australia. And it's just obviously a product that's been tried and tested over literally the last 30 years. Like, people trust it. I get it. It's been around for so long, people trust it. I get it, it's fair enough. Like, we can see some aluminium windows that are literally 30 years old that look like they just came out of the showroom, right? That's not always the case. It all generally comes down to the powder coating, right? Where, obviously an aluminium window is not going to deteriorate. It's not going to rust, right? So it's great for, sea climates and, cold climates and whatever else, right? But sometimes the powder coating on that can obviously get chalky and powdery, but it doesn't impact the performance, obviously. But the thing
it's the popularity is around the durability of the material?
I believe so, right? 100% believe that the popularity literally comes down to the durability, because the other biggest selling window is then a timber window, right? So we usually have timber windows, or we have aluminium windows on the market, right? Then there's also some that are cast iron, which literally most people don't have new. Now they're sort of have been phased out more than often. But if we talk about most things that people are purchasing now, it's generally aluminium and sort of timber on the market, right? When it comes to timber, people just love the idea of timber. And this is just like, when you're saying if you wanted to be a window, right? You ask the question, it's like, if you could be any type of window, you would want to be a timber window. Like, they're beautiful, right? They're elegant, right? They're sustainable. Like, we can just grow it, right? Aluminium, you have to mine. There's a finite amount of aluminium that we have on this earth, but we can grow more trees, right? We can grow more timber windows. And so, they're great acoustically and, and also thermally. They're fantastic if they seal. But the biggest issue is that most of them don't seal. But the reason I think that when it comes to, the difference between why more people prefer aluminium, I purely think that it comes down to the fact that us as a people are generally lazy. And what I mean by that is timber windows, because they're natural, will deteriorate. So we need to look after them, right? Because it's a natural product. Like, we've seen that plenty of times before, right? If it's not properly painted and looked after and maintained, it's going to rot. It's going to deteriorate.
Over time, yeah.
Right? And so what happens is they don't have this, huge lifespan. But in saying that, does it really matter? Because we could just grow more of them. And so this conversation sort of comes up around, around that. The other sort of product that's now sort of starting to become a lot more popular, I would say in the last 10 years or so, more like literally came into the market around 10 years or so, but really started shaping and sort of making, I would say, a dent would be probably over the last 3 or 4 years, right? And that's around what's called PVC windows. And ultimately what they are is literally a plastic. It's a man-made product. When I say PVC, people are like, well, what is that? You say, well, plastic windows. Are like, does that mean the glass is plastic? And I'm like, no, the glass is still glass, right? The frame itself is plastic. And people like, the very first thing that people will say, right, when I talk around PVC windows is like, is that going to be okay for our sun? Is it not going to break down? Like, absolutely. Like, the sun coming in, is it going to deteriorate? Is it going to break down? Like, because I think like we already have this mentality around, well, I don't want to purchase timber windows because I don't want to look after them, right? But I know that if I put a little bit of effort, they can last, right? But PVC, like, how do I even protect that? Like, the sun's obviously going to deteriorate, and then I'll just have to change my window soon anyway. Yeah, PVC sort of just come into the market. And I personally am a huge fan of it. And the reason I'm a huge fan of it is because all those misconceptions that people have around PVC are like not even true, right? So obviously the very first question people say is it going to deteriorate? Well, It's actually interesting because we've had some of our team working with us, right? And I remember one of our guys who was with us, who's still with us now, right? First year or so working with us. And he literally said to me, he's like, do you know what, James? Like, I'm not convinced on the PVC yet. I was like, what do you mean? He's like, I'm actually not convinced that it's not going to deteriorate in the sun. And I was like, are you kidding me, mate? Like, you've literally been here a year selling predominantly PVC windows, right? And you're still not convinced? And I literally just asked him one question. I said, what are your downpipes made of? And literally looked at me and I could see just this light bulb go off in his head. And he's like, oh, yeah, my downpipes are PVC. I know mine are, right? My downpipes are leisurely 30 odd years old, made of plastic. And they haven't deteriorated in the sun. They haven't broken down. They're literally 2 millimeters thick and they carry water through them.
They've been around for a while.
So how much more will a window that's been specifically engineered and manufactured to hold heavy glass work and not deteriorate in the sun? But in saying that, you know, sometimes it also comes down to the fact of, you know, that only time is going to tell whether something's going to happen to it, right? And I can say from our point of view, we've had a product here for over 10 years, right? And we have not had one issue with any discoloration, any breakdown in our PVC frames. So ultimately what you need to consider when you are thinking around PVC, for example, right, being a plastic frame, is that firstly, it's exceptional performing, right? It's literally almost as good, if not on par with the performance of timber. So if we were to compare a PVC window, all of these, let's just assume all of them seal well. Let's just assume as like they all seal properly. They all have the same glass specifications between them, right? We have a PVC window, we have a timber window, and we have an aluminium window, right? All three of them, same glass specs, all completely sealed. We are going to get different performance values that come out of them. We are going to get different thermal performance from them, purely from the frame itself, right? Timber is obviously the pinnacle, and that's why I say if you want to be a window, you aim to be a timber window, right? But very close second, if not on par with first, PVC, right? And the great thing about PVC is it doesn't require any maintenance. Timber does. And then obviously below that, you then have aluminium, right? And then when we start talking about aluminium a little bit more, I'll delve into that a little bit more. We'll start talking around thermally breaks and all the stuff you need to look for when it comes to aluminium, right? But when we talk around PVC, you know, we have this biggest misconception around it not being, you know, suitable for the conditions that we have here in Australia. And short answer is, if that PVC frame has Australian standards or New Zealand standards, wherever you are, they're obviously the same, right? If you have Australian or New Zealand standards, it is fully compliant to the conditions that it's in, right? So there is a big distinction between what is called PVC and uPVC, right? And it's really important to understand the difference between the two, because PVC will deteriorate in the sun. It will go brittle. uPVC will not. Okay. In order to have that U value in front of it, that U letter or whatever else you want to say, it needs to have a certain chemical in it, right? And that chemical is called titanium dioxide, right? And it's ultimately found in sunscreen. So by having a certain amount of that chemical will make it reflected against the sun. That chemical composition comes down and that's what's tested. If you meet the minimum standard of that, then you're fully compliant to Australian standards. You should have no concerns, right? And that standard came in literally in 2014.
It's quite recent.
Well, realistically, that's 7 years ago from where we are now. Like we say that's recent, but actually, if we look at it, it's not that recent, right? So it came in 2014, and then there was a year of leniency where from 2015, there should be none, just purely PVC windows on the market, only you.
Yeah, gotcha.
The short answer is you don't need to be concerned around PVC windows, any health implications, anything like that. It's been fully rated. There's no concern. So ultimately, it just comes down to your preference now, right? And it's going to come down to a cost and benefit point of view, right? Because then if we start talking about aluminium, we all understand that aluminium being a metal is always going to react to temperature more so than anything else.
the analogy of that handle on, say, for example, in your cooking pan, just having that metal, right? Then maybe having a wooden handle versus having that plastic like coating on top of it, reducing that heat transfer.
That's exactly correct, right?
Yeah,
100% correct. Like we make pans all made out of metal, but the handle is not made out of metal generally. It's usually made of, like I said, timber or plastic because it doesn't conduct heat, right? The last thing we want to do is, I need to move the pan and literally had your hand burn.
Yeah.
Contradictory, right? I'm cooking my food, but now I need to go to the hospital because I got 3rd-degree burns. And that's the same thing that we're doing into our windows ultimately, right? Because it's a metal window. So here we have some people literally that are going out and like, oh, buy my windows. They're aluminium. They're double glazed. They're going to solve all your problems. But it's like, but who cares what type of glass you've got in there when the frame itself is the weakest point, right? It could even seal 100%, but who cares when heat is literally it's going to sit in the sun and literally absorb the heat from the sun and then transfer that straight through to the inside. Like purely contradictory. You might as well leave the window open. So that's when we start talking around things like thermally broken frames, right? And people talk around, oh, is a PVC frame thermally broken? Well, the thing is like, or a timber frame thermally broken. They don't need thermal breaks because they're not a conductor of energy.
Yeah.
Right. So it only comes down to needing thermal breaks where there's metal involved.
The metal frames, yeah.
Right. So in saying that, when we start talking around, thermal breaks, what happens is we have this window now that's made of metal that's actually made from 2 portions of a window, the outside portion and the inside portion. Right. Yep. And they don't actually touch. They have something in between them. That's that buffer between them. Right. A thermal break, so that if you want, you can't just transfer through the frame. You literally get stopped. And guess what that thermal break is generally made of? PVC.
Yeah.
Because it's a composite, like it doesn't react to temperature. So I find it really interesting. So here we have and the idea behind aluminium, right, is because aluminium's so tried and tested, people just love it, right? But it's still a metal. If you were to have these same glass specs, even a thermally broken aluminium window compared to a PVC window, you're going to get better performance from a PVC window than a thermally broken aluminium window. But if you were to compare the cost between the two, a thermally broken aluminium frame is actually going to cost you more generally than a PVC window. So in saying that, you're literally paying a premium for thermally broken aluminium to have a product that doesn't perform as well. Seems contradictory to me, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But in saying that, like I'm saying, like we sell PVC windows, we sell thermally broken aluminium windows, but we give recommendations to what we think is actually going to be best suited for most companies. Well, for most companies or most clients, right? Tell me what your needs are, tell me what you want, and then I'm going to give you recommendations, what I think is going to be best for you, right? So if we think about, we were lucky enough in the last little bit to be partnered with, or actually supply windows to Adelaide's first, or South Australia's first 10-star rated house, right? Based on the Nathers system, the Nathers energy system. And as a result of that, we were able to rate 10 stars, right? And we supplied thermally broken, triple glazed aluminium windows and doors for that project. So best performing house with our worst performing windows. Yeah, they were triple glazed, right? But we can get better performance for less with something else. And it's really quite interesting because the whole idea behind this house is that it was used as like a prototype house, right? Look at what we can do, under these circumstances. And everyone, the very first thing someone asked is, yeah, but what's the cost? What's the cost to build a house like that, right? And in saying that, they're like, find out, it's like, oh, the windows are actually a substantial part in the, in the cost of the house. Well, obviously they're a huge part of that house. So really quite interesting. So in saying that, like, I'm still a huge fan of, aluminium.
Yeah.
Go on.
Is that because I suspect that there is a design element to it, so people going for a certain look and feel, and hence why they go for that metal frame, or
potentially,
is there an element of customization as well? How customizable is PVC? for
Well, look,
instance?
realistically, if we're thinking around it, like when we talk around like a high performing window frame, most of them like have to be fairly robust. And when I say robust, like people use the word chunky, right? Like most people come to us and like, oh, we want great performing windows, but we don't want thick windows. We don't want them, you know, we don't want them to look thick and chunky. We're like, well, you get one or the other. Because keeping in mind that glass needs to go into window frame.
Yeah.
And that window frame needs to seal. So you can have one of two things. You can have very little frame and not have a frame that seals, or you can have substantial frames that seal properly that also, you know, work great. So as you can imagine, like if you can imagine, for example, aluminium, like because it's fairly robust and fairly, you know, thick, like the frame itself is say, you know, starts at like 70 millimeters. It doesn't have as much design flexibility because it's obviously a metal, right? Whereas in PVC, for example, we can bend and flex that frame. Like we can create arches, circles, triangles, hexagons. There's a lot more flexibility in the design aspect of PVC than what we have obviously towards aluminium. But timber also has more than aluminium. So aluminium is, you know, has some restrictions, but for whatever reason seems to be the most popular, which I find quite interesting. And then on top of that, there's other, you know, design elements where we have, you know, timber windows with an aluminium extrusion on the outside of it, right? Yeah. So that we literally have the performance and the maintenance-free element of aluminium, but the comfort and the design and the elegance of timber. And that seems to be really, really popular too. But again, not a cheap exercise. If you were to compare the price between all those products, PVC is the most economical. And in relation to what's the best frame for you, I think it's going to be on a whole lot of different factors. Factors that I think are, you know, too much to cover in the short period of time that we have here.
Yeah.
So I would be, you know, just considering those and figuring out what's going to be the best thing for you. Also happy to have, you know, for people to reach out and ask more questions around that.
Yeah.
So obviously we've talked about the seals, super important. We've talked about the window frame itself. Then we can obviously, you know, start talking around, obviously double glazing, I think is, you know, a key element of what I think. Obviously that extra panel of glass is always going to be the extra layer of insulation. And I think people understand that that's better than obviously single glazing. But I do think that it's important to talk about what happens between the glass itself. You know, lots of window suppliers will just sort of put air inside of it. We'll say, here's a panel of glass, here's another panel of glass, and what's in between it? To, you know, and most of the time it's just air. Now, there is a couple of things to consider around that. I'm sure you would have experienced it plenty of times before. You know, you've had a cold glass of water, right? You've had a glass, you've had some cold water, you put cold water into the glass, and you've had water pool on the outside of that glass, right? Purely from an element of condensation, right? Because there's a varying temperature difference between the outside, obviously in the glass and outside of the glass.
In the room, yeah.
Obviously really common inside of houses, specifically in the winter time, right? When it's really cold outside and we're sort of sleeping in our bedrooms and, you know, we're breathing and we usually have a heater on or something, we're expelling lots of moisture into the room and we're heating it up so it's warmer and you know, water just builds up on generally the coldest element, and that's usually the window, right?
Yeah.
So that also happens in between glass, right? So if you can imagine, like if we're just putting air inside of glass, we do run risk of getting water pooling inside of those panels of glass. So super important to be, I would be saying, looking at upgrading that to being a specialized gas or a pressurized gas inside of that. And the most common gas that's used is generally argon. So we usually go from air to argon. And that's definitely what I'd be recommending, because by pressurizing it, argon is more dense than air. And as a result of being more dense, it actually makes the window more energy efficient. It actually makes it perform better thermally, but it also makes it perform better acoustically. And the reason that is because sound cannot travel as quickly through argon as what it can through air. So, you know, definitely a couple of things to consider around that. Then
is there a huge premium moving from one to the other, from air to Argon?
In relation to cost?
Yeah.
Yes and no. It depends on, I guess, where the value comes from, right? Is that additional cost to Argon outweigh, you know, the value that comes through it? Comfort. To me, if in 5 years' time I get condensation building up in between it, then to me that extra little bit of cost has already outweighed the inconvenience of having that glass replaced.
True.
Right. So, but then in saying that, then there are plenty of companies that will say, no, you don't need Argon because it's just going to escape anyway. Right? It's just going to slow release and escape anyway. So it's like, so why purchase it in the forefront? It's like, well, firstly, if you're making a window frame that leaks gas, then that's probably not a good thing. Right? Not that gas is a concern, right? Because obviously we're breathing Argon every breath that we take. There's no health implications to that gas.
Yeah.
But there are plenty of companies that say, look, it's just going to release, it's just going to dissipate anyway. And I'm thinking to myself, well, if you're allowing that gas to escape, you haven't spent enough time in making sure that it's not escaping to give you a great performing product for a long time. And so there's definitely something else to be considered, right? So I'd be asking the question, is that gas going to escape? Right? See, obviously we talked about gas. The other thing that I think is really, really important to consider is the glass itself, right?
Yeah.
The specific type of glass. And there is literally one panel of glass out there that I think is an absolute game changer. And it does not get talked about enough. People have heard it, I think, and there's rumors about it. It seems to be like this big secret, right? But it's ultimately a panel of glass that will help to make your windows more energy efficient by reflecting heat, right? So ultimately, when we talk about performance, I might actually come back to that, and I'll talk a little bit around performance, right?
Yeah.
Because I think we all understand, like, when insulation is talked around, we usually understand that insulation is measured on what's called an R value, right? You know, we have a wall, you know, we've got some insulation inside of that, and it's rated as, I say, an R2, right? But then we've got this other product that's rated as an R3, right? Yeah. The R3 is going to work better than the R2, right? The idea behind the R value is the higher the number is, the better performing that insulation is, right? Whereas when it comes to windows and doors, it's a different measure. People actually ask me, like, oh, what's the R value on your window? It's not actually the same. When we talk around the performance, we talk around a U value, right? So similar to, like, when it comes to uPVC, right? It's a completely different scale, but it is a U value, right? And that U value is measured on a transfer of heat, right? So if we can imagine, if we've got a window and we've got sort of the sun coming through that window, the less heat that transfers inside ultimately is going to make it better performing, right?
Sure.
Likewise, in the wintertime, if we've got the heater going inside and less heat escapes out of that window, it's going to be better performing, right?
Yeah.
So the idea behind is how much heat is transferring through that window. The lower the heat transfer, the better performing. And ultimately, like, if you're comparing two window companies and two window suppliers, I'd be asking for the U value of both of those windows, because that's really where you're going to see the best value for you. Because let's be honest, right? You get given a price from one company, you're given a price from another company. You look at the two, right? They both have the same picture on it. They both have the same, you know, size on it, but there's two very different pricing between it. It's like, well, you know, how do I determine where the value comes from? The value ultimately comes from the performance of that window, and the performance is governed by the U value. Right? So if we're then talking around, you know, how do we find, you know, great performing glass to lower that U value, we need to be talking around this layer of glass that's, you know, got lots of different names depending on what company you're dealing with, right? You know, a smart glass or an eco glass or an energy efficient glass, a comfort glass is different terms that have been used. But ultimately, all of those things come back to the fact that it needs to be a low E glass, right? Is what most people would call it, because people struggle to say the word emissivity, right? So it's a low emissivity panel of glass.
Yeah.
And the idea behind it is that it's got a coating on that glass, right, that will help to reduce heat transfer, right?
Yeah.
So if we understand, how light travels, right? If we understand that, light coming from the sun, heat coming from the sun travels, light travels in three forms. It travels in infrared, right? So if we're standing in the sun, right, we can feel the heat in our skin, right? That's infrared. We understand that light will travel in visible light. That's the stuff that we can see.
Yeah.
And then light also travels in UV, right? And that's the stuff that, we talk about all the time, like make sure you're wearing sunscreen, right? That's the stuff that gets into our skin, and that's what breaks down our DNA and causes skin cancers, right? It's the stuff that, damages our floorboards, right? It's the stuff that, fades our couches and our cushions, everything else, that's the harmful stuff. And the idea behind this panel of glass is this coating on this glass is it's going to reflect a lot of that back out, right? But obviously in the winter time, this coating is going to reflect that back in, that infrared that we've got from the fireplace or from the heater or even from our own radiation, right? Our own infrared, as we're standing in a room, we're heating it up. It's going to reflect that heat back in and retain that temperature. And so it's ultimately special coating. And it's what interesting is...
Which paint is the coating on?
Oh, great question to ask. So generally in a double glaze system, it's going, what I recommend is, if we can imagine, we've got two panels of glass and one, obviously the panel of glass, if we start on the inside, we want it to be in between the panels of glass, but on the inside. So on the inside of the inside panel, right, is generally where it's put, and that's where we get the best results. If we literally took that glass out and flipped it, right, and it was on the inside of the outside, we wouldn't get the same results. We would actually get worse results depending on where it's in, which is quite interesting. But in saying that, right, if we talk around this layer of glass, there are results to show that one single panel of low E glass, right, in a 4 millimeter panel, 4 millimeters worth of low E glass in a single glazed unit has better thermal performance than some panels of glass, two panels of glass in a double glazed system. So straight away, why would we spend money on double glazing when we can get better results from single glazing in relation to thermal performance? Like, it's not, obviously double glazing is still going to be better around acoustics, right? But if we're just talking around thermal performance, low E is better than two panels in a double glazed system. So here we have all this time, it's like, by my windows, the windows are sealed, right?
Yeah.
They've got argon inside of them. They don't have low E though. You don't need it. It's like, but why wouldn't I need that? Why do I want to have to, change my curtains in a couple of years? Why wouldn't I want my house to be more energy efficient, more comfortable, and maintain a better temperature? Right? So to me, it's literally imperative to have it. Every time I talk around it, it's like, if you're going to get anything, make sure there's low E inside of it, right? Because like what I'm talking around, ultimately, like the stuff that I've explained and how it works, most people relate that to how tinting works.
Yeah.
Right? Well, tinting is there literally to make it, cooler in summer and warmer in winter. It's used to, to reduce heat. And that's exactly how this coating works. The difference between the two, though, is that tinting darkens the glass and actually restricts light. Because the way that tinting works, it works like sunglasses, right? Where, as you notice, it's darker. But what we've done is we've polarized the light. So if we can understand that light is traveling in lots of different directions, right? Light forms are traveling in different directions. And by polarizing specific light forms, we're actually stopping them from coming in, right? And by stopping them from coming in, we therefore are restricting the amount of visible light that comes in as well. but we are combating the heat and the UV that goes along with it, right? But we're also restricting the actual physical, visible light as well, right? And most tinting, depending on the color of the tint, literally is restricting light by like 60%. Now, in the summertime, 60% of the amount of light that we have in summertime is, that's not really a concern, right? It's usually quite glary, like we don't really care. But the problem is you're putting that tint on to be on all year round. What happens in the winter time when we have, overcast, and we're literally the minimum amount of light that we have, we're reducing that by 60%. So to me, it's like, well, let's make decisions that are going to impact us over the year. Like, let's make long-term decisions rather than short-term decisions based on the situation that we're in. And so when people come to me, they're like, oh, look, I want tinting. I say, great. Why do you want tinting? Well, I want it to reduce the heat. I want it to reduce the glare. Great. We're going to get all of those results from low E glass. Let's opt to keep the low E glass that we've got, that from us actually comes as a standard. Right? Let's keep that. And if you don't get the results that you want, we can go to another, we can go somewhere and put an artificial tint on there. But most of the time that doesn't happen, right? Most of the time people are actually like, I'm actually getting great results already without darkening the amount of light that comes in. So yeah, if you're picking between tinting and low E, I would always say, always pick low E. Because what's also interesting, right, if we talk about thermal performance, is by darkening the glass in the tint, we all understand that, dark colors do what?
The absorption.
They absorb temperature, right? Darker colors are going to get hotter than lighter colors. So what we're doing is literally putting things in our glass that makes them darker, that stops light coming in and heat coming in. But in saying that, we also have now darkened it to absorb the heat. So to me, it's actually contradictory to an extent. In the short term, it actually works fine. In the longer term, sitting in the sun, it absorbs the temperature. I've literally touched panels of tinted glass that I literally have my hand burn. We have to get past the stigma of what we're actually told is the solution to our problems. But to me, like, if you're thinking around upgrading and you want to get better performance, like, to me, the best thing you want to be doing is literally looking at what's, triple glazing, right? And you'd be surprised, as soon as I say triple glazing, people like get a little bit scared. They're like, double glazing, I've seen it on Grand Designs. It's already going to be double the cost because it's got the word double in there.
Double in it.
Right? So obviously it's double the cost. Don't even talk to me about triple because I cannot afford it. Have you got a price? No, but I can't afford it. Right? Let's go through the exercise and then you can make the decision, right? So to me, I will say that when it comes to, like, everything has to come down to a value proposition. Like, I don't know how other people think, but I think everything comes down to value, right? How much extra value am I getting for the amount that I spend, right? It's literally $1 billion industry. Do you want fries with that, right? Do you just want to go that extra step up, right? And we pay premium to get a whole lot extra, right? And so to me, we have to then weigh up, like, what is the cost benefit to upgrade from double to triple? But obviously we need to weigh up what's the cost benefit to go from single to double. Right? So if we're then comparing, let's say, triple glazing versus double glazing, and we have a system that is completely sealed, right? Then we are going to be getting generally around 30% better performance in triple glazing compared to double, right? So let's assume 30% less energy needed to maintain a temperature in the room with a triple glazed window compared to a high performing double glazed window, right? All right, 30% better performance, fantastic. But what's the cost associated with that, right? Right? What's the cost benefit? So 30% less energy, we can work that out, but how much does that cost? And realistically, it's from our point of view, it's only like 10 to 15%. So to me, like there's value in that. For an extra 10 or 15% extra, I can get 30% extra value. And that to me is really beneficial, right? As an organization, I would say that that's really our sweet spot in the industry. Now that does vary, obviously, depending on what company you're dealing with and whatever else. But I would definitely be looking at exploring options, but work out the cost benefit. How much extra value are you getting for the extra outlay that you have? And that's ultimately where the first conversation comes is, do I go from single to double? Do I go from single to high performing? Right? Because remember, there's a distinction between double glazing and high performing, a very big distinction.
Yeah.
You could have a poor performing double glazed window. So, you know, we've talked around the stuff that incorporates a high performing window, right?
Yeah.
So if we want to know the difference, we literally then have to go back to that uValue, right? So recapping what we talked around the uValue, us as an organization, go on.
Touch on a little bit on the solar heat gain.
Ooh, yeah, great question. Okay, so when it comes to solar heat gain, because ultimately all windows are measured on two things, and that's something that I didn't really touch on. They're measured on two values. One, the uValue, okay, which is, as we mentioned, a heat transfer between the window. And the lower the number, the lower the heat transfer through the window, the better performing it is, right? Yep. Then the other scale that we have is what's called the solar heat gain coefficient, or the SHGC value, right? Yep. And the idea behind that is that we would have the idea behind being able to capitalize on the sun and allow us to not use artificial heating cooling, but use the sun's heating to maintain the temperature in the room, right? So theoretically, the uValue is a measure of heat transfer, okay? The lower the number, the better performing it is. But on the other hand, when we talk around the solar heat gain, it's also around heat transfer, right? Because the idea behind it is that we would absorb the heat from outside. So theoretically, we've got two values, solar heat gain, and we've got the uValue. Both of them are a measure of heat transfer. One says it's better when it's lower. The other one says it's better when it's higher. So to me, there's just this really big distinction. They're literally both measuring the same thing, and both of them work in direct competition with each other. But both of them are considered energy efficient, right? Because let's in practicality and theoretical understanding, if the sun comes in and heats up my room, that's better for me, right?
Yeah, during that winter time, yeah.
During the winter time, right? And then what happens is people make decisions because it only incorporates really the winter time where we can absorb in that winter sun. Because in the summertime, what do we want to do? We don't want any of that heat coming in, right? So the idea behind it is let's capitalize on that winter sun. And so people will make decisions to generally remove the low-E coating out of those windows to be able to absorb more temperature through that window, right? That's generally what people are doing. And this is what I find really interesting, because they're making that decision on obviously the idea and the premise behind the winter sun. But let's put it into context, right? Let's look at this over a year span, right? Because everything to me has to be, energy efficiency is measured on long term. It's not measured on short term. In the short term, in the winter, we can absorb on that temperature. But let's just pretend, right, that we had every single day in winter as a beautiful, sunny winter's day. Let's just assume that's the case. Every single day of winter. 90 whole days in the year. In the wintertime, we've got beautiful, sunny days that we can capitalize on the warmth that comes from the sun. What about the other 260 odd days in the year where our biggest issue is actually combating the heat that we have. Right?
So when it gets to that 30 degrees there in summertime.
Like this, so this is where like it has to come down to practicality. Theoretically, it absolutely is great to capitalize on that winter sun, right? But the idea generally behind it is that it would come in, right? That the practicality behind capitalizing winter sun and using the solar heat gain coefficient is that it would come in and obviously go on our slab, heat up the slab, and give a slow release of heat throughout the day, right? Fantastic theoretically, right?
Yeah.
But how many people have carpet or laminate or tiles on top of their slab? How many people, or how often do we actually have enough sun to heat up our slab? You actually need a good 3, like if I think about, realistically heating up a concrete block, it's not going to heat up from 10 minutes of sun.
Yeah, need a solid chunk of time.
You need a consistent, considerable amount of time for that slab to actually heat up. You literally need days. And so it's really interesting how we put so much focus on this one value that to me doesn't actually bring that much value. But in saying that, so lots of people say, look, I don't want low E because I want to capitalize on that winter sun. Right. But this is where we need to then understand the difference between the two values, right? A U value is literally 0 to infinity. Okay. So much, much larger demographic between the two. When we talk around the solar heat gain coefficient, it's literally a scale of 0 to 1. It's literally very, very small compared to the U value on the other side, which is much, much larger, right? So when we opt to have low E glass inside of a window, we will substantially reduce the U value, right? So the overall thermal performance of that window will be substantially increased. But when we have the low E glass, we only minimally impact the performance of the solar heat gain, right? So yes, we are going to reduce the solar heat gain. It will be reduced. We won't get as much through it, but we get only a little bit less compared to the extra value we have on the other side from the extra thermal performance that works all year round.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting when these sort of conversations come up, where lots of focus seems to be put on the solar heat gain, but there's a really big disconnection where people are like, no, I don't want the low E because it's going to impact my solar heat gain. But the low E only minimally impacts your solar heat gain, but marginally impacts your U value. So regardless of whether it's winter facing windows or wherever else, always have low E. I'm always going to recommend that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I have very interesting conversations with energy assessors between what actually holds more value. But at the end of the day, we still need to always still comply to get those energy ratings. We still need to comply with, the solar heat gain coefficient. But yeah, the industry has changed. Even from the government's point of view, they've actually said there's a big misconception that, low E glass actually negatively impacts it. You get it's disproportionate. So even they've realized that all these energy assessors, all these people are actually got the idea wrong. And the government's actually saying, oh, actually, no, we've put these things in place to think about this, but it's not as important as you're saying it is. And there's actually this misconception, which I find really interesting for the government to actually, to come out and say that, because that's where it should come from. Everything should be governed from the government. The problem is it doesn't always play out that way. The government responds to what people are interested in.
Fascinating. And also with the two specs, the Uvalue and the solar heat gain coefficient, do you find that the specifications depend also on the daytime or versus nighttime use of the space? or doesn't have a big influence?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can't say that I would actually know the answer to that question. I don't think that it would really play a part in how that space is being used. It's really
so, for example, like with offices being predominantly used during the daytime, whereas with our homes, we are there for a larger chunk of, well, now it's both day and night. Previously, it used to be just the nighttime. Buildings that are a little bit more sensitive to, say, nursing homes, for instance, where you have the elderly staying there, staying in those spaces. So especially within their individual rooms, the night performance is quite more. Does that come into play, or not necessarily?
That would be a question, I think, that would be really directly proportionate to an energy assessor. Like I said, they take into account lots and lots of things in relation to that. I obviously only have the information when it comes to the windows and doors aspect.
Yeah.
But I can't say that that question has ever been posed to me. So as a result of that, I would say realistically, shouldn't actually impact whether what time of day it's being used or not. Obviously, when we're talking about energy efficiency, when we talk around shading and things like that, it does play a part. Obviously, how the sun travels at different portions of the day. You talk about shading in different areas and orientation and whatever else. I think that would probably play a bigger part. But I can't say that, at the end of the day, when it comes to windows and doors, it should make no impact what time of day it's being used.
Yeah.
Ultimately. Because
should have that consistent performance throughout.
It's being used 24/7 inside of the performance of that house, regardless if someone's in that space or not.
Yeah, thanks for breaking that down. But it sounds the best starting point is starting with the end in mind. So what is it you're trying to accomplish? And in this case, comfort is high up there, both in terms of the thermal comfort and just how you feel in terms of temperature wise, and the acoustic comfort, which is something that we rarely take into consideration as well. And then from there, now you start to get into the different elements of it's the ceiling and the frames and the spacing and the gases that are in between the spaces, and then the type of glass as well. And then to seal it off, the two key specifications, which is a U-value and the solar heat gain coefficient. Just before we wrap up, with the two values, how big? Because sometimes what I've seen is that there's a little bit of a confusion in terms of, because the glass and the frame, they have different performance values, and sometimes people might be looking at the U-value, say, just for the glass alone, but when you take the system as a whole, which gives you a more accurate picture, those specs might be impacted negatively, and then you get a poorer outcome. Maybe just briefly touch on that, whether it's something that you see, whether it's a common thing that you see in the first place, and just shed some insights based on your experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would say that most of the results that are coming out actually incorporate the window and the frame, like the entire window generally is how it plays out. But depending on the frame and depending on the glass, you can have one that obviously performs better than the other. So it's really important to understand like the information that you're getting. Is it for the entire window, which I think is obviously really beneficial, just as you mentioned, right?
Yeah.
Because if we just know the glass and we just know the frame, at the end of the day, who cares? It's the proportion of the glass and frame together to give the overall result that we, want or need inside of a hole inside of our house, right? Because depending on the design, there'll be more frame, right? So it's really important to understand the proportion of glass to window frame. So ultimately, I think it's too hard if you're literally saying, I want the window performance, I want the glass, the frame performance, and then you have to incorporate that information. Way too hard, way too much work. Just get the end result. Although when it comes to passive house, that is generally what they want. They want the frame value and they want the glass value, and that's how that calculator works. But most calculators will literally work, most energy calculators will literally work on the end value of that window. But in saying that, right, when we talk around that, it is important because most, to get the actual overall result of that window in its entirety. Most of the time, if we jump onto sort of, certain platforms, you look at a PVC window that's got argon gas and low E glass and whatever else, it will spit out a number saying you can expect a value of this, right? But it's only a bench line, because what if you change the size of that window? What if you change the openings of that window? All of those things are going to play a part in that end result. So to me, if we jump on things like WEIR's, the energy rating window system, for example, and you were to see some information, you can get good baselines, but you're not going to get a clear understanding of that size window in that design, giving you the result that you need.
Cool.
So that's definitely, the thing to consider is, certain platforms will be great, give average sort of baseline results, but they're not potentially going to give you a clear representation of what you're going to get. I'd be speaking to the window supplier to actually say, can you give me the performance values of these specific windows? Because they can vary substantially between the size and the proportions or whatever else.
Yeah, true. Awesome. On that note, I think we'll wrap it up. Thanks again for making time for both part 1 and part 2. Just before we go, if someone wants to learn more about whether it's yourself or the company, where should they head?
Yeah, appreciate that. So if you want to learn more about myself, my name's James. I run webinars. I just have a passion for, spreading information, allowing people to make great decisions. I love informing people. So you can literally just search for me on LinkedIn, James Mateko. I'm sure we can put some details down and actually put my name down or whatever else. Yeah. Otherwise, if you want to get in touch with, our organization is called Okna Lux. And you can find us literally by typing in Okna, OKNA, Lux for, luxury, and searching for us online. Look, we're excited to have conversations with people. So, jump on our websites, jump on our socials. We're ready to have some conversations, super excited to be able to give whatever value that we can to help you make some great decisions. And if we can do some business together, fantastic. But that's not what we're about. We give great results for our customers. But in saying that, we can give great results for our customers because we don't work with everyone. So, if it works out, you can get some value from it, fantastic. If it works out and you want to do some work with us as well, then that's cool too. So feel free to reach out. More than happy to have some conversations.
Awesome. Thanks again, James. And
it's been a pleasure.
We'll speak soon.
Looking forward to it, mate. All the best.
Cheers.